We're going to go ahead and get started on this morning's session. Welcome to the second full day of our conference. Let me just give you a brief overview of what we're going to do today. This morning, we'll do sessions 4 and 5. We'll have a networking lunch at noon, and then back in the afternoon for sessions 6 and 7. The closing reception will be from 6 to 7 this evening. I want to let you know in advance, that's an event that I hope you'll take advantage of. That will be in Powell Hall. It's about a block south of here, and there's really a spectacular photo display waiting for you there. The Howard Buffett photo display is here until this evening. After this evening, it's removed and moved on to the next city. So I think it's an even more outstanding exhibit than what they had at the World Food Prize a few years ago. So we'll do that this evening. Let's go ahead and start, though, with today. In session 3 yesterday, we covered markets and finance as two drivers for successful scale-up. In session 4, we're going to focus on additional drivers and enabling conditions for successful scale-up. I'm really pleased to introduce Johannes Lin to give an overview about drivers and enabling conditions. As Carolyn Wu and I prepared for organizing this conference, we read a lot of literature, as I mentioned yesterday, and a name that we kept coming across was Johannes Lin. We're very fortunate to have Johannes with us today. He's currently a non-resident senior fellow with the Brookings Institution, and prior to that, he worked for many years with the World Bank. Johannes.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I must thank our organizers, Caroline and Suzanne, really from all my heart, because this is maybe the first and the biggest event of its kind dealing specifically with scaling up, and I'm extremely grateful to Purdue University, to Caroline, to Suzanne for having brought us all here. It's been quite a day and a half already, and for somebody like me who's for 15 years worked on scaling up and starting, as Larry was saying yesterday, in a somewhat maybe lonely place, it's wonderful to see, even though this morning it's still a little scant, the numbers in the room, but they'll fill up. It's great to see so many people interested in a topic that I, Larry, Richard, and many others who've worked on this topic for a while care about. So many, many thanks. This is terrific. My job this morning, apart from trying to wake you all up, is to sort of introduce the topic of enabling conditions that are necessary and supportive to a scaling up framework and approach. Now I need to find my, here they are, okay. So it's the enabling conditions that we want to talk about, and in order to do so effectively, what I propose to do is that we put enabling conditions first briefly into a practical framework for assessing scaling up pathways, and then actually do a deeper dive into what enabling conditions may be appropriate and necessary to consider, and I would argue consider systematically as a matter of course. So the simple practical framework that I want to briefly present to you in many ways is very down to earth. It starts with the recognition that scaling up is part of an iterative process of innovation, learning, and scaling up. On the left-hand side, you have this, of this graph, you have the new idea, a new model, an approach, an intervention that you think might work. You pilot test it for limited impact, obviously. From that, you learn with monitoring evaluation, which we discussed yesterday evening, and learning in this process, and then building on this internal knowledge, and to some extent on external knowledge, and you also want to bring and need to bring to bear. You then carry out a scaling up assessment, ideally, and then move, if and as appropriate, towards scaling up to multiple impact. So innovation, learning, scaling up are very much part of this process, but it's an iterative process, which is very important to remember. It's not linear from innovation to scale just one way. There are these feedback loops that are shown in this graph, which means as you scale up, You need to continue learning. You need to continue actually adapting through, and indeed through innovation even as you scale up, adjust and adapt to the process, learn, and in this, as part of this iterative process, hopefully achieve the multiple impact. And of course, it's impact that you care about, as we talked about yesterday. So that is the starting point. Now, what we found, and I'm particularly working on this question of scaling up in a practical institutional context, where I was concerned about how do we get institutions to systematically focus on scaling up. I found that 6 questions are a good starting point to check whether an institution, actually, and individuals and programs within institutions are concerned effectively with scaling up, but also as actually a planning tool that the project leaders, the managers, and in the institutions can use to check whether or not they are actually systematically scaling up. So the 6 questions very briefly are: what's the problem to be solved, the vision and the target of scale that we want to achieve to solve the problem? Secondly, what are the ideas, the innovations or models that can and should be scaled up? Thirdly, what is the pathway to scale? We discussed this yesterday. Is it commercial, public, or hybrid? Horizontal, vertical, functional? Is it expansion, replication, diffusion, or as yesterday mentioned by Larry, is it collaborative? A fourth question, this is the one that we're going to dig in a bit deeper, is what about the enabling conditions, the drivers that drive the scaling process forward along the pathway, but also the spaces that need to be created for your initiative to be able to grow, or the obstacles that have to be removed. So what are these enabling conditions that have to be in place to actually allow your initiative to grow? Fifth, how about the sequencing of key steps? As we discussed yesterday, scaling up is a fairly long-term process, and thinking about how you sequence the process is actually very important. And finally, does monitoring and evaluation support learning for scaling up? These are the 6 questions. I applied these with colleagues in various institutions that are shown in the right-hand side of the box. And it was the starting point for the formulation of an approach on scaling up that we prepared for the IDIA group, the International Development Innovation Alliance of about 10 large international funders. And we also prepared for them a toolkit that allowed them to actually apply this set of questions and dig deeper in areas where they felt there was an interest. And I'll come back to that a bit later on. We also used this basic approach together with IFAD, and actually it was work with IFAD, jointly with IFAD, where we developed this sort of broad approach. And I'm happy to say that IFAD is now using key elements of this approach, these set of questions, in its operational work, having developed guidelines and now incorporating scaling systematically in its operational processes and its country strategies, as well as its individual projects. We also used it in working with the UNDP, where for 4 country programs, we reviewed with country staff how effectively they actually integrated scaling up into their country programs. And here you see a particular example of how we, through this sort of, in this case, 4 color systems, helped them assess how well they were doing in dealing with various aspects, including, and very importantly, you see in the middle part of this graph, if you can read it, are the enabling conditions, the drives and spaces, to what extent the staff had adequately considered this, and where they needed to do perhaps a bit more work in systematically considering relevant aspects. So when you look at this particular graph, you realize that among the 6 questions, as you dig deeper, actually the enabling environments, which are the middle section here, drives and spaces, are really critical elements. And so this is the, if you wish, the invitation that I took to now dig a bit deeper with you into what are the enabling conditions that one should systematically review as one is exploring a scaling up process. Very briefly, one way to visualize this is to say, well, you have your innovation and your intervention that you think about scaling up, or if, on the other hand, you have your vision of a problem, but really in between, you need to think about, so what's driving this process forward? What are the spaces that have to be created? And monitor and evaluate. And it's always worth remembering, perhaps, this very simple graph as we go through this, considering the drives in spaces that are relevant for the scaling up pathway. So a bit in a pedantic way, perhaps, and I apologize for this early in the morning here, let me briefly run you through some considerations regarding some of these key drivers and key spaces that I believe need to be systematically considered. First of all, and very importantly, and I think we came across this already a couple of times in the discussions, champions and leaders are absolutely essential and have been absolutely essential in many successful scaling up processes. Norman Borlaug is sort of maybe the best name to mention here, but of course there are many others. And I have to say, when I heard President Adesina talk, I got very excited, because if you have a leader like this talk and hopefully walk the talk in his institution, that is a tremendous driver for actually having an organization like African Development Bank take the scaling up agenda seriously and move ahead with it. This is the same we had in the World Bank for a while with Jim Wolfensohn when he was president in my days there in the early 2000s. Now, on the other hand, of course, weak leadership or a strong opponent can be a setback and a barrier to scaling. A champion's exit or leader's exit can be a problem and cripple actually scaling up processes. And the World Bank is an interesting example, because Jim Wolfensohn was a strong leader, a strong driver of scaling up in the World Bank. He left, his successor couldn't care less. And so in the World Bank, as a systematic approach, scaling up sort of withered away. And of course, it isn't only important for the actual implementer of the scaling up process. In funding institutions, it's also very important, and by the way, in research institutions, that the leadership is really behind the scaling up agenda. The second set of drivers that are very important, and of course we discussed yesterday repeatedly, are incentives and linked incentives accountability. It can be in the commercial pathway, of course, the most typical incentive are profits, but they can be supported by subsidies. Regulations can be supporting and driving, or as the case may be, impeding the scaling up process. Competitions are actually a very good way to sort of provide incentives for scaling and have been widely used in by various organizations to support scaling up. Results-based financing can be provide incentives to scaling. Now, not only positive incentives, negative incentives can get in the way with the Texas regulations. And indeed, it's worth remembering that short-term incentives, subsidies in particular, that you put in to sort of get the process started, if you're not careful, in the long term, can actually become an obstacle to scaling, not least because subsidies, as you scale up, may run into fiscal constraints. But if your business model depends on the subsidies, then of course, you run into trouble with your scaling pathway that isn't going to be sustainable. Now, I mentioned already incentives need to be matched by accountability. If you give incentives, you don't keep track of whether the incentives actually work. Through an accountability and transparency, information, monitoring, evaluation, of course, then you may be wasting resources and effort. So you better have an accountability process linked to the incentives. And finally, just to mention here, later on we'll talk about the policy space. And of course, incentives are basically formulated and introduced through the policies pursued by governments or institutions. The third major driver that we also discussed in some detail yesterday are markets, market demand or community demand. Market demand for the commercial drivers, community demand for the more social interventions where you try to support communities. If the communities don't want what you're doing and what you're proposing to them, if there's no demand for that, then likely you're going to run out of steam very quickly. Time is limited, so I'll go on quite quickly. Turning to spaces, as I said, thinking about what spaces you have to create to actually have the opportunity for growth and for scaling, meaning what barriers have to be removed. There are a number of them here that are worth considering systematically. There's political space. It's very important, and I put it first because if you don't systematically assess who are the winners and the losers from your scaling up process, you may miss opportunities to actually get the supporters in line and also be aware of what opponents might indeed want to stop what you're doing because your innovation that is, once it's reached a scale in particular, can be quite disruptive and indeed can lead to losses of traditional players that are operating in your area in which you're dealing. So it's very necessary to explicitly assess and address, based on evidence and using advocacy, the possible political barriers or to create political demand for your intervention. The policy space we already talked about a lot, and I won't say much more, and I think we'll probably discuss that in considerable detail later. But it's important, of course, that the policy space be supportive and needs to be carefully assessed. Fiscal and financial space is, from my experience, perhaps one of the most important and often most troublesome areas. So what you need to do if you think about scaling up, you need to seriously look at the cost structure of your intervention. Are the costs coming down? Are they steady? Are they going up as you scale up? The revenues that you generate through the activity that you are supporting, or the resources that you can bring to bear externally through credits, by bringing in investors, or of course fiscal. And here constraints can be very serious, and yesterday we talked some extent about the opportunities on the investors, private investor side. For funders, one of the most critical questions is how do we and when do we actually stop funding, and what happens when our funding withdraws? And it's a question that is too often neglected and actually stops scaling processes in their tracks. A fourth space, very importantly, that we'll talk later on in one of the breakout groups is institutional space. What's the institutional commitment of organizations that need to carry the scaling up process forward, and what is the capacity to scale that they have? Also very important, in scaling up process, you actually have institutional transitions. The institutions supporting the upfront innovation part of the process tend to be quite different from the ones that are the institutions that are actually implementing and sustaining the scaling up process later on. There are additional spaces, which I will not go into great detail. Partnership space, without partners, basically no scaling in my experience. There's environmental space, very important for you in the agricultural sector. And of course, when you think about scaling up climate-smart interventions, you better think about the environmental aspects of your programs and projects. Cultural space, we'll perhaps hear more about that in another talk later in this morning. But cultural constraints can actually get in the way of scaling if your beneficiaries don't actually appreciate from a cultural perspective whatever the interventions you're proposing. Finally, information space. Again, I will not go into detail here, but you better think about what is the information needs and what are the methods by which you can effectively generate information on whether your scaling up process works, but also whether the enabling conditions are actually in place. My last slide then is just some very practical lessons. It's not enough to have a good idea. It's not enough to have a vision of scale. You also need to fully understand and systematically assess and address the enabling conditions. The enabling conditions can be and are often internal to the innovator, implementer, and funder, but they are also, of course, external, and so both the internal and the external enabling conditions have to be assessed. As mentioned yesterday, enabling conditions are extraordinarily context-specific, and so you cannot have a silver bullet, but you need to look at the enabling conditions in each and every case. They may change over the pathway, so you better monitor whether or not you're actually focusing on the right enabling conditions as you go along, and you better adapt your interventions as you go along to make sure you address the evolving enabling conditions. And finally, just to flag one point that deserves further attention, but I won't go into here, is enabling conditions for sustainability and scalability are closely related, but they're actually not working always the same way, and so you need to look at them separately. Finally, just some references. If you look at those slides later on, here are some links to some documents that you might find helpful in thinking more about enabling conditions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johannes. We're very fortunate that Johannes will wrap up session 4 after we have a couple more talks and then some breakout groups on this. Because behavior and culture and policy and governance are two sets of drivers that often don't get adequate attention, as we consider successful scale-up, we've included those as separate short talks prior to doing breakout groups. Let me introduce Bill Ryerson, the president and founder of Population Media Center, to talk about behavior and culture as drivers for scale-up.
Good morning. In freshman psychology, I read a paper by Solomon Asch, a Harvard psychologist who studied conformism. And he would hold up two objects of different length or draw two lines of different length on the blackboard and ask one by one each of maybe 20 people in the room to identify which one was longer. One person there was the actual subject. The rest were all plants instructed secretly to give the wrong answer. So he'd call on all of the plants and they'd all give the wrong answer, and then he'd call on the actual subject, and almost every time that person would name the shorter line as longer. And what that tells us is that people are very driven to fit into what they perceive to be the cultural norm. And it also tells us that changing norms requires changing the perception of what is normal. So Population Media Center, which I founded 20 years ago, has worked through entertainment mass media because people don't tend to go home at night to listen to or watch public service announcements. And we work through broadcast and online media, radio, television, and online, with programs that reach people on various issues. And we do multi-issue programs intentionally because people see these programs as being about life in the country as opposed to a program about agriculture or a program about women's rights. So we deal with an array of issues in interweaving storylines in multiple settings in any country. And so far we've worked in over 50 countries and have reached 500 million people. Norman Borlaug served on our program advisory board for many years because his experience, as he said to me, was that actually creating the high-yield wheat and maize was the easy part. Getting the farmers to adopt it was the more difficult part, and he saw the value of entertainment mass media in changing behavior. What we particularly focus on is role modeling rather than messages. So we don't tell people what to do. We show characters trying different strategies and realizing different consequences. And in a formulation created by a telenovela producer at Televisa, Mexico's largest network, a man named Miguel Sabido, we have positive and negative characters that one finds in all melodrama. And then we have middle-of-the-road characters designed to represent segments of the audience, and they gradually sort out the conflicting advice from the positive and negative characters and evolve into positive role models. And they both demonstrate the benefits of the new behavior and show the audience how to deal with the pushback that comes from trying innovative practices. These are long-running programs in the radio formulation, and most of our programs in Africa are on radio because it's still the dominant medium, particularly in rural areas. These shows are twice a week for a year and a half to 2 years. And we have gradual evolution of the characters to avoid creating backlash. And it only happens after we have a large audience and they have bonded with these characters. We start getting letters from people saying they've named their baby after one of these characters. And at that point, we know that that character is going to have more influence than the Minister of Agriculture or the Minister of Health. These are all locally written by local writers in local languages using a methodology that I described very briefly. It takes 3 to 4 weeks in training writers to get across all the details of this methodology. And by using the largest or most popular languages, these programs are at scale immediately. We do extensive formative research to understand the cultural barriers to adoption of the practices. And the practices we're promoting are those that are in the policies of the host government. We do extensive monitoring and evaluation, so baseline and post-broadcast quantitative surveys, and monitoring at points in the infrastructure, asking people what motivated their visit. Among the theoretical underpinnings, in addition to Solomon Asch, is the work of Stanford psychologist Albert Bandura, who's known for his social learning theory, which is about how people learn from role models and what makes a role model more or less influential, and social cognitive theory, which deals with self-efficacy and the belief that somebody has both the right and the ability to adopt a new behavior, because if they think change is impossible, they won't even attempt it. These long-running programs are particularly effective at addressing ingrained issues. Certainly, if somebody's already motivated to get information and to use it, then simple public service announcements are adequate. But when you're dealing with issues like child marriage, daughter education, violence against women, family planning, and other practices, some of these take a long time to get men as well as women to identify with characters and have those characters walk them through a whole transition in their own thinking about how to address these issues. As I mentioned, these are multi-issue programs that make them more entertaining and more realistic as the way life is in that country. And an example of a multi-issue program that we've done is a program we did in Rwanda that addressed reproductive health issues, but also reforestation. And it had both urban and rural settings that allowed those different issues to be brought into play. As I mentioned, we've worked in over 50 countries. We've done 40 different dramas in 20 languages so far. And these programs are generally broadly listened to or watched, where we have both an entertaining program on primetime broadcasting and particularly in cases where the media market is still relatively non-competitive. However, in mature media markets, it's still possible to have a big hit, as we amazingly did in Hollywood. We have a donor who said, well, we have a teen pregnancy problem in the US, why don't you do a show on TV in this country? And I said, how are we going to compete with Hollywood? And he said, I don't know, but I gave you the money, try it. So I went out and met with Nellie Galan, who had been head of Telemundo, and said to her, you know, Hispanic teens have the highest rates of teen pregnancy in the US, and we have a donor who wants us to address this. And can you give me some advice? And she said, yes, Carlos Portugal. So I ended up hiring Carlos Portugal to be the director and head writer of a show called East Los High. It's about a high school by that name, a fictional high school in East LA. And it's about the lives of the students in that high school, and it includes their romance and backstabbing and sex lives, as well as the competitions of the dance troupe with other high schools in Los Angeles. And it ended up that 8 networks wanted this show after we had produced 24 half-hour episodes. We put it on Hulu, and it became the #1 show on Hulu Latino, and in the top 5 on all of Hulu. And just completed last December, but you can still watch it if you go to Hulu. You can watch the first 2 seasons free to view. And that program has led to a new program we're doing about the lives of young people in Harlem. The scripts for that show were shared with the producer of Game of Thrones, and as you may have heard, he's now ending Game of Thrones next year and is going to work with us on another show in the US, so stay tuned. These shows have impacts that make them worth doing. It's not just an entertainment show. So, for example, the cost of a show in northern Nigeria per person who adopted family planning, which the show modeled, and attributed that decision to the program, was 89 cents US. That included 208 episodes, writing, acting, production, primetime air purchase across 4 states, and all the research. In The issue of child labor and child trafficking, we've addressed these issues in Haiti and in West Africa. In Niger, the listeners were far more aware of exploitative child labor than non-listeners. In Cote d'Ivoire, similarly, listeners knew at least 3 factors that can lead to child trafficking at a rate much higher than non-listeners. With regard to reforestation and forest conservation, a program we did in Papua New Guinea, the listeners to that show were more than 4 times as likely as non-listeners to have sought forest conservation services. And in Rwanda, I mentioned that we had addressed reforestation. It was a minor storyline there, but 11% of tree seedling buyers named the program at points of purchase when they were asked why they were buying tree seedlings. We have addressed child nutrition in a number of countries. In Burkina Faso, our listeners were 1.5 times as likely as non-listeners to understand the importance of immediate breastfeeding, and listeners were 1.6 times as likely as non-listeners to have ever given oral rehydration salts. So these are just a few examples. We're dealing with child marriage in quite a number of countries. In Nepal, our listeners were more than twice as likely as non-listeners, and this is after running multivariate controls to factor out income, education, and place of residence. They were more than twice as likely to have intervened to stop a child from being married. In Ethiopia, our listeners dramatically increased and significantly, statistically, increased the ideal age of marriage for women compared to non-listeners. In Senegal, listeners were more than 6 times as likely as non-listeners to believe that a woman should be at least 18 before she's married. In Rwanda, listeners were twice as likely as non-listeners to believe that a woman should be at least 19 before she's married. So in summary, these programs address multiple issues. They're much less obvious than a single issue program, which appears to the audience to be like an infomercial. And they address deeply ingrained cultural norms, but they can also address less ingrained issues simultaneously, and they are very effective at generating demand for services. I should have mentioned in Sierra Leone, surveys of new family planning adopters at clinics across the country during our broadcast there showed that 50% of new adopters asked or named the program by name when they were asked why they had come for family planning. So these are the countries in which we are doing such programs, and here's the list of those countries and the current programs that are on the air. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you. You'll be able to discuss those that topic area of behavior and culture with Bill more in a breakout session. Now we want to move on to policy and governance. We certainly have heard that a number of times, and thank goodness we have a session on that, a breakout group, and we also have a speaker on that now. David Spielman will introduce that topic to us. David is the Senior Research Fellow with IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute.
Thank you very much. It's a little hard to follow the creators of East Los High to talk about public policy, but I'll try my best. And then I'm going to go home and watch East Los High. So let me start by saying, what's the scaling agenda all about? And let me offer a few thoughts of my own, just because I have the podium. So to me, the scaling agenda is all about the following. First, it's the global consensus that we have to urgently solve certain problems in the world: malnutrition, poverty, food security, and environmental sustainability. And we have this sort of global backing, this consensus from the SDGs and the Paris Accords and whatnot, to help us on our way. Second, it's the idea that we have and can use this wealth of science and technology to solve these problems, whether it's zero-tillage systems for maize and wheat and other crops, to gene editing and dreams like Apomixis. Third, it's the belief that we can move quickly from scientific inquiry to real-world applications, that we can't or don't just innovate, but we also, we can't and we don't just invent, but we innovate, right? We develop and market products and services that help farmers, workers, entrepreneurs, women, and men tackle these sort of intractable problems we face. And underneath all of this is a very simple theory of change, that the adoption of new technologies and better management practices on the farm will lead to on-farm productivity gains, which in turn lead to improved welfare and better nutrition and other desirable outcomes. Of course, we all know that the world isn't that simple, right? That the innovation process isn't that simple. That's fairly linear, and I'll blame it on Larry Cooley and the log frame because of that. There's simply too much heterogeneity in both the human condition and our natural environments to think that this can work every time and in every context at scale. In fact, or maybe quite obviously, we know that public policy can have a significant influence on this theory of change. In fact, I'm quite thrilled, I think, as Suzanne and others are, that policy has figured in so prominently in the remarks given by Akina Adesina and by Larry and by many others in our conversations during these past 2 days. But I'm also a wee bit horrified that we think people are only now coming around to the idea that policy matters. I mean, some of us have known this for a very long time. My world, obviously, at the International Food Policy Research Institute revolves around policy. That's probably not surprising. But if you really think about it, your world revolves around policy as well, right? Public policy is a broad enabler or disabler of our lives, of our educations, our healthcare system, our reproductive rights, and our safety nets in times of need. And public policy is the broad enabler or disabler of innovation and scaling innovations in any country. And when I refer to public policy, as Johannes was saying, I mean a range of things: laws and legislation, rules, regulations, and guidelines, public investment programs, public transfer programs, producer subsidies and taxes, consumer subsidies and taxes, trade rules, trade laws, and regulations. Public policies can make or break efforts to advance technological change in agriculture. And scaling through and with an enabling policy environment is just non-trivial. In fact, the largest success, arguably, the largest success in agricultural development and poverty reduction may have resulted from a simple change in public policy and its associated incentives. That was the land tenure reforms in China between 1978 and 1984. The challenge, many of you know, was that there were widespread food shortages and very low farm productivity levels in China after 30 years of collectivization, the collectivization of agriculture. The policy innovation started in Anhui province and moved onwards to the rest of the country was simply to reintroduce household farming, returning more than 95% of the farmland to 160 million rural households and allowing them some control over the decision-making on what and how much and how crops were grown on that land or livestock. And the impact during that 6-7-year interval was to increase grain production by 34%, increase rural incomes by 137%, and reduce rural poverty by 22%. The technological and market opportunities that made this all possible followed from the policy change, right? But policy change processes are not as simple as all that. China may be the outlier in the story. Policy change processes can maybe be thought of in a much more complex diagram, which I hope you won't memorize, in this, which was based on a piece from Meyer. We're constantly thinking about policy change processes in terms of, the standard circle of sort of design, pilot, implement, evaluate, revise, design, implement policy. You know that circle, you've seen it many times. But in fact, the policy process is horribly, horribly complex. There are a near infinite number of ways in which an innovation system can tackle the scaling process through policy, and this suggests just that. In policy design, this means there are any numbers of mechanisms to allocate resources and create social and economic surpluses, for example, through transfers, subsidies, taxes, tariffs, and fees. But insufficient attention is often paid to identifying how policy affects durable change at scale, the trade-offs, the risks, and the unintended consequences induced by policy change, or the winners and losers in these policy change processes. And even when we do understand those trade-offs, risks, unintended consequences, winners and losers, simple policy designs don't always work. Why? Well, we know that the way policies are designed matters as much as the policy itself. For example, planning a spatially explicit or a special agricultural processing zone or growth corridor investment will not automatically induce farmers to change their farming practices at scale. A lot more has to go into the process. It may be a process of coordination and cooperation, but it may also be a process of contestation and conflict. And even if the process is well managed, well executed, and well implemented, it can quickly devolve into those sort of coordination problems where we have in agriculture when multiple ministries and agencies and organizations are involved. This is a slide from Sarah Shearer at Eco Agriculture Partners that gives you just a sense of what one project might entail, right? If you're working on a watershed project or a landscapes project, right? You're dealing with multiple ministries, multiple agencies, all of which have their own mandate and their own turf to protect over one particular area. So that leaves us, I think, with a really big question. What kind of evidence do we have on the types of policies that might advance the scaling agenda? What works, for whom, and at what cost? And I think we tend to be rather timid about answering this question. There are good reasons why durable adoption at scale of new technologies and practices is so limited, and we've already talked about a lot of them in this conference. Things like land, soil, water, and biology, farm size, scale, and farming system, individual and household characteristics, access to credit, access to inputs, and access to commodity or output markets, and land tenure systems. And we already have, I think, a good idea of a lot of the policy solutions that can address these particular constraints. Public investment in infrastructure, research and extension, public finance, financial sector regulation or deregulation, land titling, seed system regulations, and so on and so forth. But there's also a class of lesser known, harder to measure, and unobserved constraints to adoption. Things like risk preferences, loss aversion, aversion to ambiguity that farmers face, impatience or time inconsistent preferences and present bias, or aspirations that were just discussed in the previous presentation, and sort of the economics of hope. And the question we should be asking is, do we have policy solutions that can affect these individual behaviors and preferences as well, so that people feel less constrained in their decision making and actually choose to pursue technologies and practices resulting in adoption at scale and technical change at scale. You can think of this in terms of the burgeoning literature on policy nudges, if you will, or you can think about it simply in terms of some of the things we've done in developed countries, such as the large-scale impact of taxes, fees, and regulations on cigarette retailing and reducing cigarette consumption, or think of the large-scale impact of automatic retirement savings deductions on your paycheck. So all this to say that we have a lot of instruments out there. We think about the big things, as Akina Adesina and others were talking about subsidies, subsidies, subsidies. Are they good? Are they bad? Should we use them? Should we not use them? That's one class of policies we should care about. But think about the wider set of tools we have at our disposal. It's not all about subsidies. I think we know that. Let me just wind up with a few points. First, scaling, and I'm reiterating here, scaling is all about the enabling policy environment. Policy may not be everything, except in my world, but it should loom large on your scaling agenda. Second, we've used policy as a fairly blunt instrument to date to advance durable change at scale. But there's a lot more we could do with other, more thoughtful approaches to policy interventions. Third, policy change, as I said, is fraught with risks, trade-offs, winners, losers, and unintended consequences. Be very mindful of those things. Fourth, policy change processes really do matter. As scientists, innovators, economists, practitioners, whatever we are, we seem to be fairly naive about the policy change process. We need to dig deeper into that and understand what's really going on in the background as we move forward. And in sum, we can and should know more about the reach of public policy, its limits, and the complexities of policy change processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Well, we hope that that's given you a snapshot into the two of the 5 discussion group options that you'll have now. So besides the 2 of them on behavior and culture and policy and governance, there will also be sessions. Sean Ferris will lead one on resource constraints. That was chosen because agriculture is a bit unique in some ways with regard to those types of resource constraints. Richard Cole has agreed to do a session for us on institutional support. And Holger Cray from the World Bank will do a session on infrastructure, which was certainly one of the topic areas that Johannes referred us to.